Sadly, they weren't available, so you've got me. Just think of me as the before shot. A bio on today's speaker is in the bulletin and online, and notwithstanding that, space did not permit us to list the achievements, all of the achievements of this leader in men's health research, and I must add, of international acclaim, leading his team in a lot of good work. Amongst many activities in his field, Gary heads the research for the Freemasons Foundation Centre for Men's Health, established about 7 or 8 years ago as a joint venture between the University of Adelaide and the Freemasons Foundation, with a vision to enable men to live longer, something many of us in the room would wholeheartedly support. Healthier and, of course, happier lives. Gary heads a multidisciplinary team of well-renowned experts collaborating across clinical services, research programs and continuing education as part of its mission. We're also delighted to have with us Marg McGee at the head table, the Executive Director of the Centre for Men's Health, and Rob Klein, the CEO of the Freemasons Foundation, as well as past Chair, past District Governor Don Serra. Currently, the Centre is actively engaged in research programs in all areas of men's ageing, male obesity and diabetes, prostate cancer, male androgens, hormones, sexual and reproductive health, masculinities and sports. We're delighted to have a world leader with us today to talk about the myths of men's health, including important issues such as regular checks, prostate testing and the importance of women in men's health. Please welcome Professor Gary Wittert.
Well, thank you for the invitation to be here, for the very kind introduction, and I hope I can do the subject some justice. Before I do, you've already had some introduction to Rob Klein and Don Serra from the Freemasons Foundation, to whom a debt of gratitude is owed for much of what I'm about to tell you today, because the foresight of the foundation in partnering with the University of Adelaide and twisting their arm a little bit to come on board has really allowed this work to be done and for the centre to grow and accomplish what it has. And that's been work that's been dependent on many of my colleagues throughout Adelaide, as well as nationally and internationally. So I could call this talk False Facts, but that's just a little bit too Trumpian. Not exactly an example of men's health. So if you want to think about everything to do with the opposite of what I'm going to say, then think Trump. So I want to talk about testosterone. Testosterone is kind of like the male mojo, the chemical that drives the essence of manhood, or is it? Well, that's a debatable thing, and if you believe the advertisements in the Sunday Mail, usually somewhere towards the end, filling a page, or the Telegraph, or any of the other tabloid-type newspapers that can be read in 20 minutes and purchased on a Sunday, barely in English, they are advertising clinics that promise you the elixir of youth. One of the adverts promised me that if I walked into a room, I would be swarmed by attractive-looking women if I came to them and took their testosterone. I would have my youth restored, my vigour and energy, and my waistline back. Well, it turns out that testosterone does not normally go down with age. So many people will find, many men will find, that the testosterone level is low, and that's because, gentlemen, it's inversely proportional to our waists. So what should our waists be, and where is the waist? Anyone want to tell me where the waistline is? So it's not, yes, someone's, it's not where your belly button is. It's from the bottom of the rib to the top of the hip, in this line under the armpit. You put a tape measure around horizontally, and if it's more than 95 centimeters, start running. Preferably in the opposite direction from food. If it's over 100 centimeters, then you're in trouble. The other things that make testosterone go down is when men stop smoking. Now that seems ironic because stopping smoking is extremely good for you, and under those circumstances, the somewhat increase in testosterone that you get is not a survival advantage if you're willing to continue smoking. The other major factor affecting testosterone is depression, and I'm going to come back to depression in men in a little while. So to keep the mojo, and this is going to be a recurrent theme, you need to stay fit, slim, and sleep well, and have lots of sex because that also increases testosterone. Comes under the use it or lose it banner. How many people, I don't suppose you really need to declare this publicly, but let's assume that there are a large number of people in the room who get up to pass urine at night, and even if you don't, if you did, would you consider it a normal part of aging? We see whether anyone would consider getting up at night to pass urine a normal part of aging. Okay, no one's going to answer without legal advice. Yep, okay, thank you. So most people. And who would think that it's got something to do with the prostate? Okay, so neither of those things are necessarily true, and in fact, mostly, it's got nothing to do with the prostate. So you can get up 3 or 4 times a night to pass urine. We call that nocturia. So anything 2 times or more is called nocturia. And you can get that if you have a small prostate, or a medium-sized prostate, or a big prostate. And you can have a big prostate and no trouble with your waterworks, except perhaps when you stand next to your 9-year-old son like I've done, and he can pee over the fence in a field and you can't even reach it. But that's not really a problem. So why, alternatively then, would men need to get up at night to pass urine? Well, it turns out, and it goes back to the recurrent theme, that obesity is one cause, lack of physical activity is another cause, high blood pressure, having a low-fiber diet, having diabetes or even just a slightly raised blood sugar, and then importantly, a condition called obstructive sleep apnea. Now, what this is a one step further along from when you snore. So what occurs at night is there are mechanisms that keep the airway open. Snoring occurs when there's some partial collapse of the airway, and then air is moving in and out over tissues that are now vibrating. It works just like an instrument. Unpleasant to listen to, but an instrument nonetheless. Now, when that airway is so collapsed that the air actually can't get past it, that's when you get an apnea, or if it's only partial, a hypopnea. And what that means is you're either not getting any air into the lungs, so you can't exchange oxygen, so the blood oxygen falls, or it lowers because there's not enough coming in. And in people who have significant obstructive sleep apnea, that can occur if it's mild, 10 times an hour, if it's moderate, 20 times an hour, and if it's severe, 30 or more times an hour. And I've seen people where it can occur 100 to 170 times an hour. Can you imagine? 170 times an hour, you stop breathing. It's hardly any time to breathe. A couple of gasps and the next hour's there. So it turns out from in our cohort study, which is a study of men living in the northwestern suburbs of Adelaide, we included, with the last round we got funded by NH and MRC, so this is in 2010, a series of home sleep studies that were in the end technically satisfactory in 867 men. So these were all men over the age of 40 from a whole variety of backgrounds. 1 in 2 of these men have sleep disordered breathing. They block their airway up at night. That's 50%, half. And in half of those, it was moderately severe or severe, meaning it needed treatment. And then in half of those again, so ultimately 1 in 6, don't get in your car and drive until you've had this treated. How many people in that group had actually been diagnosed by their doctors as having sleep apnea? 8%. 8%. When we talk to our colleagues who are involved in sleep and we ask them how they manage this, oh, we don't worry unless people are sleepy. Well, it turns out that of all the things that are associated with severe sleep apnea, sleepiness is not one of them. So it's unhelpful to decide who's most affected. But what is helpful is having high blood pressure, particularly if it doesn't go down at night, and getting up at night to pass urine, being depressed, so coming back to depression recurrently, losing interest in sex, not because of testosterone necessarily, but because probably more likely depression and energy, and so that fatigue and lack of energy are also important factors. There would not be a day in practice, and I only do 2 clinics a week, so take this as you will, that I don't diagnose someone with obstructive sleep apnea who's not been diagnosed before, but who's clearly had it for many, many years. The other revelation, which is only recently becoming understood, is that it was generally thought to be rare in women. Now, no respecting husband who's interested in his safety or well-being ever tells his wife they snore. Try it, see what happens. But it turns out this condition is in fact probably equally common in women as it is in men, and it presents differently, which means that it's missed. So women will have the same symptoms. They will get up at night to pass urine with increased frequency, and it will be related to sleep apnea in exactly the same way as men. Guess what? Women don't have a prostate. Most don't have a prostate. Some admittedly do, but very few. So here's this dilemma. There's this common thought that it's due to the prostate, but in fact, if you look at the data, it's due to a whole range of factors that extend beyond the bladder. And one of the common associations with getting up at night to pass urine frequently is depression. Now I want to talk about depression. I think most people will know, because it's in the news because of Beyond Blue and a whole range of other media, that suicide in men is more common than in women. And that men don't get diagnosed with depression because they don't go to the doctor and because they don't talk. So neither of those things are true. Men do go to the doctor and men do talk, but you have to ask them questions and then they'll talk. And there's a story behind that which I won't have time to get to. When we looked at our data on health services, we found that men with depression go to the doctor more frequently than any other groups of men. More frequently. So 8 to 10 times a year, and only half of those men get diagnosed with their depression. So whether the men get diagnosed or not seems to me to be a crapshoot. And part of that is the nature of the interaction and the fact that they present with depression that's different to men. So where am I going with this? There are a lot of things that can happen to us that require extensive, complicated, and sometimes risky diagnostic tests. And I'll put it to you, because I want you to go back and manage your GPs, that with some simple questions, you can pick up most health problems in men. What's your erectile function like? Are you getting adequate erections? Because that question is only asked by 3% of general practitioners of men. Are you getting up at night to pass urine? And do you feel miserable? And if those questions are answered, you pretty much know exactly what you're dealing with. cost-effective, time-efficient, and productive in terms of outcomes. Thank you for your attention.
Any questions? Well, that was terrific, and I'm sure you'll agree. We've deliberately left a bit extra time for questions because this is an ideal opportunity to speak to an expert or inquire. So, who is our first inquiring mind? Jeff White.
Thank you. Professor Whitten, thank you for a great talk, and it's very enlightening, but I'm depressed after listening to all that. My question actually relates to testosterone, testosterone testing, use, and its any relevance to the incidence of prostate cancer. Okay. If you can just enlighten us a bit on that, thank you.
Yep. So, the first thing I will say is that there's no reason to measure testosterone unless you really think there's a reason why it's low or to be low. So we see testosterone's measured frequently, and mostly the problem is not in the system that is responsible for the manufacturing of testosterone. It's a functional consequence of other health problems. So if it is measured and it's low, then the question that has to be asked is why, not the response to give testosterone. And that's actually true irrespective of how low it is. And so even though the PBS have dropped their cutoff, we still see men with testosterones of 4 to 6 where they don't need testosterone, they need their depression treated. And that's not infrequent. If you do give someone testosterone who needs it, they benefit almost invariably. Do you have to worry about prostate cancer? Well, it certainly doesn't cause prostate cancer. That's absolutely clear and I think broadly agreed on now. If you have prostate cancer hidden away in the prostate, it will make it more obvious. And then that just requires that the current recommendations for monitoring are followed, which is looking at the PSA regularly. And then if it goes up, then getting a urology opinion. The second complication, which also goes into the recommendations for monitoring, is to look at the hematocrit. Because in about 10% of men who get testosterone, the hematocrit goes up. Hematocrit is the proportion of blood cells relative to fluid in the blood. So if you get too many red cells relative to fluid, the blood will be sludgy, like thick oil in a car. You get the idea? And testosterone will put that up in about 10% under two main circumstances, provided the level of testosterone gets quite high. So if it stays low, it doesn't really do it. The one is if you've got sleep apnea or any other lung disease, so smoking, airways disease, untreated asthma, etc. And the other one is if you've got certain blood disorders, so they're rarer, so JAK mutation or one of those things. So if you've missed the sleep apnea before and you've got someone who's going up and up and up with testosterone, then think about the sleep apnea. But insofar as the prostate's concerned, it's simply monitoring. You've done no harm if it's diagnosed. It's not your fault.
Any other people out there looking up Dr. Dougal as we speak? Don Sarah.
Gary, bearing in mind all that you've told us about how you lead into all of this, how then, if at the end of the day it's all about depression, how do you treat that?
Depression? So, I mean, you're asking an endocrinologist how to treat depression, which it's kind of like asking a lawyer how you fix a car, but anyway. Okay, so the short answer to this is two ways, and they're not exclusive from one another. So the first is the process which would involve engagement with a psychologist, which I think is critical because in many instances it's got to do with a whole lot of unresolved life issues. And I think the process of unpacking and unraveling that is always useful and complementary to medication. And in fact, in many instances, it's all that's required. The second, of course, is medication. But I think many men seem reluctant to go and see a psychologist, and for reasons not clear to me, many GPs seem reluctant to suggest to men to go and see a psychologist. And a lot of the men I talk to end up asking for a referral. So I think recognizing depression in men requires an understanding that it's not the same as in women. I think that a counselling process, because men don't talk the same way as women, like they won't discuss it with their friends and network and so on. So I think some formal referral to engage in that process, and then if necessary, medication. And I think there's a reluctance for medication, but in fact it works well and can be life-saving. At the same time, understanding that this is not just about the mind, but there's a mind-body connection, thinking about whether there's a sleep problem, sleep apnea, some other health problem going on, and dealing with those. Healthy diet, proper sleep, regular exercise is essential as a component. So those three things.
Questions? One last one from me, Gary. You mentioned the tabloid newspapers earlier. There's a constant debate raging about the importance of DREs and men and worrying about prostate issues and dying with prostate cancer, etc., etc. What's the reality? Because I've heard that in fact many men die quite happy, healthy lives, and it's not until they're dead that they've in fact identified a prostate issue. Should we have compulsory testing? Should we go overboard? Comment.
Yeah, it's a $60 million question. Look, more men die of breast cancer than women, more men die of prostate cancer than women die of breast cancer. So that's true now. So it's not a trivial matter, it is still a significant matter. The problem is the data on screening doesn't show necessarily a survival benefit, because you can have a normal PSA and have prostate cancer, and you can have a high PSA and not have prostate cancer. So the test is only as good as the circumstances in which it is taken and interpreted. Insofar as the digital rectal exam is concerned, the problem is the part of the prostate that it feels is not necessarily the part of the prostate where the cancer is. And again, it's only as good as the sensitivity of the examining figure. Now, I've worked with an oncologist in the testosterone trial that I've been running, who in our group of men recruited into the study, I think there's about 160 in our centre, she picked up 3 cancers with her finger who had normal PSAs. So my personal feeling is it still has a role, but with imaging, because you can now get it imaged, it's going to be far more sensitive, and no one really wants to have a finger stuck up their bottom. So, and no one really wants to do it, least of all me. So I think, you know, the PSA is not dead. Sequential measures over time are more useful, and then some form of imaging to see if there is a problem there or there isn't.
Any quick ones somebody's thought of? David? Last one?
Thanks, Trevor. My GP has said to me a couple of years ago now that as you approach 70, that your testosterone levels naturally drop significantly. And he recommended I go to the gym and make sure, because that'll help.
Sorry, I didn't catch the last one.
I go to the gym rather than just sort of sit there and let it happen, because that'll help your testosterone levels. I'm just wondering how that fits with your research and whether I should go to the gym or not.
Yeah, of course you should go to the gym. You could argue that the cause of your decrease or someone's decreased testosterone is a deficiency in exercise, because the reality is that the older we get, the more we need to exercise to get the same benefit. So those conditions that ail us are generally, and of course you can be unlucky enough to get a whole range of things, but generally they reflect a lack of exercise, not enough sleep, and a poor diet. So keeping lean, eating a healthy diet even if you're not lean will help, and exercising both aerobic and resistance is what will keep your testosterone level right. So he's right, but that can occur at any age, just not over 70 if you're not going to exercise, even in young men.
Move in for a second. Stay there, don't go away. Rotarians and guests, there's a lot one could say, but I think some of the myths that we might have thought of, Gary's not necessarily exploded, but given us some great food for thought. My big outtake from today's chat with Gary is talk. Talk to your wife, talk to your doctor, talk to your husband, if for the ladies in the room. It's all under control, Tony. Just talk and talk it out, because communication, good communication, is not the cure for everything, but it goes a long way to help. So, Gary, it's customary for us to give the Adela Medici Jewel Light and Pen. This is particularly important in your case because, on one hand, you can actually conduct examinations, looking down ears and up noses and other places with the light, and you can write down your prognostications and research. So, with the grateful thanks of the Rotary Club of Adelaide, and with every member standing to applaud, your Medici pen.
Thank you very much.